First, what's the point of a research paper? A research paper, if we're going to define it, is a paper that presents research. Duh. It's not that challenging to define, but why do we make you do it? And I always go through the whys because, at least for me, if I know why we're doing something and if it makes sense, it doesn't bother me as much to go through the process. So first, in school, in high school, university, whatever, why do you do research papers? Well, people, and y'all are a teaching group, right? Why do teachers make people do research? Well, number one is knowledge acquisition. You want people to leave your class knowing a big chunk of information about something. And so if I were teaching this as a history class, if this were an American Civil War class, I'd like for all of you to be able to talk in depth and intelligently about at least one major topic in the Civil War. So that's the number one reason why they make you do it, is to learn the stuff. And you say, well, why can't I just read the books? Well, the process of actually writing it down and putting it into intelligent, organized form makes you learn it 10 times better than just randomly reading books. Also, just to be practical, as teachers, you got to give somebody a grade. So if I tell you, I want you to go out and research all of this, how am I going to give you a grade on what's inside your head? I have no way of knowing, and neither do you with your students. You have to be able to see something to grade. So that's what the research paper is about too. It also promotes organized thinking. If you haven't caught on to this by now, we're spending a lot of time talking about organization and structure. That is something that you want in your writing. It's something you want in your head too. So the more you practice organized writing, the more organized a thinker you become, and the better able to handle all of the different daily tasks and challenges you'll come across. And then, of course, finally, and this is the big thing for you guys right now, is writing and language practice. You are practicing the art of writing in English, and there's no other way to get around it but to do it. You know, one of the reasons why I'm still annoyed with myself, I don't know Polish as well as I wish I did by this point, is because I just don't have time to practice. Every single day is filled up from dawn to dusk with all sorts of different challenges for me, and one of the challenges isn't learning Polish, which is actually, I can thank you guys for, because virtually every Polish person under 30 speaks English well enough for me to talk to. So in terms of actual daily life, you know, getting food and paying bills, I can usually find somebody to talk English to. In fact, when we first moved here, someone told me that it would be hard for me to practice my Polish, because when someone realized that I was a native English speaker, they just want to talk English because they want to practice English. Yeah, great. Glad to help. That's why I'm here. But, you know, it would be nice to learn more Polish. But the same thing. So you need to learn, if you're going to learn English, you need to practice English. And this is a big extended project, practicing English. And yes, we're forcing you to do it. So there. But that's in school. But what about outside of school? Because everybody goes, well, yeah, well, we do that here, but why does it matter in the larger world? Well, for you guys, it matters because this is probably going to be your job, hopefully. If you stick with the teaching track and you get a teaching job, you're going to be inflicting this on other people for the rest of your life, or at least for a good portion of it. But in academia, let's say you decide you want to become a professor instead of a teacher. Well, in academia, pushing the boundaries of human knowledge is what academics are supposed to do. Yes, we teach a lot, but we're supposed to be out there actually discovering new things. Well, when you discover something new, how do you communicate it to everyone else? You write a paper. The papers that you're writing here are a beginning form of a paper that any academic would write and get published in a scholarly journal. And so what you're going to see with this particular project is that this is the beginning form of something that you're going to develop over the course of your time here at university and hopefully afterward, because this is a beginning form of the BA thesis you're going to have to write next year. The same basic principles that we're practicing here, you're going to turn around and you're going to apply to your BA thesis. It's just, of course, going to be more specifically scholarly, a grander picture, those sorts of things. It'll be longer, but here's where you get your feet wet. This is where you practice. And then finally, in business, good information lowers risk and it advances innovation. You want somebody to invent something new, give them the information they need in order to do it. Give them an idea, give them the background and the statistics and all of these things. You want to make a company and you don't want to lose a whole bunch of money? You need to know what the risks are. You need to know what the dangers are. How do you find that out? Information. How is information communicated? In forms and reports. So what you're doing here, this is an academic form of the kind of thing you would do in any business. Somebody sends you out and says, we need to know what the risks for this project are. What do? You find out, you research your sources, you find out, you write a report. They won't call it a research paper. They'll call it a memo or a form or even if it's an email. The principles are still basically the same. You go out and you do the research, you come back and you produce it for them in an intelligent form. And if you can do that better than the next person, I can almost 100% guarantee you it's going to be you who advances and not them. Because your bosses will come to rely on you for good information and good advice as opposed to somebody who can't do this. So anyway, yeah, I think sometimes when you start looking at the basic research paper in a class like this, you're like, oh, why do I have to do it? It's so stupid, it's so basic. But the truth is, you're losing sight of the longer game. You're losing sight of the longer picture, which is this stuff actually can matter. This stuff can make a difference. So anyway, there are two basic approaches, and each has its own advantages and dangers, and we'll go over each one. Deductive research, or deductive logic, begins with a hypothesis, then it applies it, and ideally it tries to prove or disprove it. So deductive logic begins with a statement or a theorem, and then it works down from the statement or theorem. So all of the information is interpreted according to the theorem, and then the theorem itself is considered and applied, whatever, by the information that you find. And so when you're writing a paper that uses a deductive style, what you're going to do is present an accepted, modified, or rejected thesis as your result. And so what that means is sort of you start off by saying, I have this idea. I think this idea is true. Let's find out if it's true. And so you go out and you do your research and you find out, oh, this idea is kind of true. It's not exactly true. So what's true? Oh, here's my new true idea. Then you present that as your research. So you write your paper about, this is what I found. And if you can't get the hint from the screen, anybody take a guess at what deduction and deductive logic, who I should say that is most often associated with? Sherlock Holmes, yes. Sherlock Holmes, the creation of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, was huge about deductive logic and deductive reasoning. What he did was he memorized tons and tons and tons and tons of information, facts and theorems and whatnot. And then when he was presented with evidence, he could use those facts and theorems to tell you anything that you wanted to hear. So he could look at you and tell you where you worked and where you grew up and where you were from and what your problems were and all of these other things, because he would look and say, I see this speck of mud. That kind of mud comes from this place. I know that this place is here. Therefore, this person is most likely a dock worker. And so it's based on the theory first applied to the evidence. He knows all of the facts, and then he's applying it from there down. Now, induction is the opposite. And people try, I'll be honest with you, it took me years to stop confusing induction and deduction. So if you struggle with that, that's normal, because they are opposites. Deduction starts from the hypothesis and works down. Induction starts from the evidence and then works up to form a hypothesis. So you begin with an open-ended question to which you don't know the answer. With deduction, you say, I know the answer, or I think I do, and so I'm going to go find out if this is true. With induction, you say, I have no idea. And you go out and you do all of the research, and you work your way up, and once you've done the research, you find out, oh, this is the answer. And so you form your theorem as a result of all of the evidence that you've looked at, not as a result of pre-existing theorems. So you assemble a fair sampling of data, and you find out the truth. So, and if you haven't noticed, that's the one that I've been teaching so far. It's the simplest, it's the most effective for this particular point, but I want to cover both of them because, again, I don't know where you're going in the future or what you might need it for. So, deductive research, the best known example is the scientific method. So if you go into science, if you say, I'm done with this social sciences thing, no more literature for me, I just want hard sciences, almost exclusively you're going to be doing deductive research. Because the way the scientific method works is you form a hypothesis, that's, you've got your general theory, then you form a specific hypothesis from that theory. Based on that specific hypothesis, you put together an experiment. This experiment tests the hypothesis and finds out if it's true. And then there's really only 3 different options that you can have for this particular result. You can either confirm your hypothesis. You find out, hey, I'm right. It's true. Everything that I said is correct. You can find out you're partially correct. So yeah, this has got some things that are right. It's got some things that are wrong. Okay, we'll modify it and we'll move on. And then sometimes you reject it entirely. You just say, this is flat wrong, period. And then you move on. And then the result of this is an improved theory or an improved hypothesis. And of course, there's a slight difference between the two. But the goal is to improve the theory and make the theory better. So, and I say this is best known in the scientific method, but you can do this in history, you can do this in literature. So, for example, you might say, and we'll use Germany as the example again, because it's the one I happen to remember. What is, you're sitting there thinking, how do we explain the rise of Germany? Well, I think the rise of Germany was due to nationalism, economic issues, I'm being very vague, yes, and Prussian militarism. So, you've got your hypothesis. You go and you test it. You start researching sources on Germany in the 19th and early 20th century. And you find out, is this true? Well, maybe you find out that, well, yeah, the Prussian militarism had a very important role, and the economy, not so much the economy at this point. The economy was doing pretty well. I'm just making this up. The economy was doing pretty well, but not quite. And then, so you look at it and you say, okay, this is how we change it. This is what the actual result was. You've tested the hypothesis, and then when you write your paper, you present your new hypothesis. And let me also mention that most of the time, unless it's a really, really simple hypothesis, most of the time, people end up here in the partial. If you're doing any kind of complex hypothesis, you're going to end up with a partial truth. Why? Because most everybody gets something wrong when you're trying to put something together, especially if it's very complex. Sometimes you'll confirm it entirely, sometimes you'll reject it entirely, but if you're seriously trying, you end up somewhere in that partial area. So, what do you think are some advantages of this particular method? Why would this be a good way to research? Oh, I should also mention, of course, deductive research presumes you already know something substantial about your topic. Why do you have to know something about your topic in order to use deductive research?
You have to know what to look for.
You have to, if you don't know anything, how can you form a hypothesis? A hypothesis is based on an intelligent guess. If it's not intelligent, it's worthless. You know, I know next to nothing about Polish history in the 1400s. So I could guess that Polish history in the 1400s was defined by, let's go History Channel on us, by ancient aliens intervening. Now, of course, anybody who knows anything about Polish history is probably going to look at me and go, ancient aliens? What are you talking about? Well, the truth is, I don't know anything about Polish history, so I can't form an intelligent hypothesis, at least not that part of Polish history. So you need, in order to use inductive or deductive research well, you have to start off knowing something about it. So if, for example, I know some of you that I've talked to and seen are really passionate about teaching. You could probably do a deductive paper on some aspect of teaching because you already know enough about it. You've had some classes about it. You know enough to be able to formulate a decent hypothesis. But if you don't have any of that background, there's just nothing to do. It's also why scientists most of the time use it. Most of the time when scientists use it, they've got a pre-existing background in the area in which they're working, and they're trying to further the knowledge in that area. So they want to test and figure things out. So what do you think some advantages might be to deductive research? Why would you use this? Why would you want to use this?
It's easier to find information that you already somehow know something about.
Yes, that's a very, very big one. You already know where the information is. And also, if you already know where the information is, do you have to look as long or assemble as much? If you know what the specific thesis is you're trying to test, you can limit the number of sources that you have to look at. So if you're already pretty well versed on one of these topics that we're talking about here, and you can put together a hypothesis, and I tell you you have to have 5 sources, and by the way, 5 sources is the minimum. You're going to need to have, if you really want to distinguish yourself, you're going to need to have more. Now, I'm not saying you have to have 50, but if you had 8 to 10, I think that would distinguish you as opposed to hitting the bare minimum. So anyway, you have to have, let's say you decide you're going to use 8 sources. Well, if this is something you really care about, if you're a real fan of the Witcher games, to continue with that example, then you've got your sources right there. You've got the Witcher books. You probably already know what they all are. You've got the Witcher games. You've got those. You may actually have some Polish books that talk about the original legends. You've got the TV series right there. And so you don't necessarily have to go any farther. You're not going to be spending hours in the library going, where am I going to find sources? We just found them for you. And if it's a topic that you're interested in like that, boom, you're done. So, of course, you also have to stop and ask, are there any other sources out there that I should look at that might question what I think about this? But, so yeah, that's a big one. Focused research, a clear idea of what's being tested, easier to set standards for success or failure. Because, if you begin with your hypothesis of the Witcher TV series is unfaithful to the legends, and I don't know if it is or not. I haven't read the legends. But if you begin with that hypothesis, it's very clear you're going to be able to know one way or the other, is it or is it not? You're not going to be wondering, how do I do this? What do I look for? You have a clear point of view that you can work with. It also often is very uncontroversial. It's what I call politically safe research. Why do I say that? Because a lot of times, especially when just in general, when you see inductive research used, it's all about making the status quo happy. Now, why does that happen? Why do I mean making the status quo happy? Because it begins with whatever theory is popular. Everybody is talking about this particular theory. So I'm going to test this particular theory. So I take that theory for granted and I give a hypothesis based on that theory and I test it. Oh, wow, gee whiz, looky here. Everybody likes what I'm doing because everybody likes the theory. To give you kind of a practical example, Marxist history was a huge example of this, at least in the States, for many years. Marxism was the rage on the political left, and many historians loved it. And so what they would do is they wouldn't think of their own theory. They would just take Marx's theory and they would apply it to different situations. So they would say, my hypothesis is that based on Marx's theory of economics, the United States Constitution was a document that was written entirely by elites to maintain the status quo. And they go out and they test, oh wow, gee whiz, we found out that we think Marx was right. Of course, the problem is that when you take the theory for granted, and this is where we get into disadvantages. I'm also going to put it up there, I've already said it. When we get into disadvantages, if you already have made up your mind before you begin your research, it's very easy to go out and find evidence that says you're right. So, and that's what a lot of Marxist historians did in the United States and Europe, was they went out and they only looked at things that made Marx look good. They didn't ask the hard questions because all they were doing was following a sort of biased version of deductive method, and they were just reinforcing Marxism, which has since come to be roundly rejected by many scholars. Now it's been replaced by, hopefully you see what I mean though about this being safe. When Marxism was popular, then doing this type of research meant that you could ride the popularity of Marxism by producing more and more Marxist history. But if you're somebody who's going to question that, somebody who's going to come in and say, I don't know if this is true, I don't know if Marxism has actually been vindicated, then you start making people mad. You know, how dare you talk about our precious baby that way? Marxism as a whole has fallen out of theory, out of favor. It's been replaced in the States by what's called race, class, and gender, which is, I'm sure you've seen a lot of. Spend 5 minutes reading any professional journal and you'll see references to this, such and such applied to this race, such and such applied to this gender, gender studies, queer studies. That's the new approach, which people have pointed out is really a form of neo-Marxism. But that's another whole separate lecture. The whole idea is that, yes, this can be a great approach. Especially for you guys right here, if you want to be targeted, if you want to be focused, great. But it can also be that tool of propaganda. If somebody gives you a theory and says, here, prove this, using deduction. Don't question the theory. I want you to prove it. Write a hypothesis and make sure the hypothesis makes us look good. It's not great. It's possible that emotions can push us one way or the other. So, I must confirm or deny this because this is what I want to be true. And you'll find yourself, maybe thinking about that. If you're very, very passionate about whatever topic you're working on, that's why you know a lot about it. It's because you've read a lot about it. You love this stuff. If you start getting into it and you find out that maybe I was wrong, that it's hard to resist the temptation not to just prove it true anyway. Or at least claim that it's true anyway. Because you've started off with your hypothesis, you want it to be right. If you're going to use this, you have to have a really sort of objective scholarly detachment. You have to be willing to look at that hypothesis and say, I can be wrong about this. And if you can't, you can run into trouble. So it can also, this is going to kind of contradict what I said earlier. It can also produce artificially controversial research. Because sometimes what people will do is they'll look at a theory that has been proved and they'll go back and they'll say the exact opposite just because they want to make waves. So there will be something that's popular, something that is accepted. And in this case, for our scenario, we'll say, yeah, maybe this is correct. Somebody will go and write a paper that does the exact opposite just because they want to make people mad. Now, why would they do that? Well, making people mad gets attention. And if you're trying to get ahead in the world, getting attention can be a good thing. And of course, the point with all of this research isn't to get attention. It's not to produce propaganda. It's not to push this particular social theory or the other. I hope our goal when we do research is to find out the truth. To find out, we're never going to be able to find out the truth 100% guaranteed beyond all question. But I hope we're trying to get as close to it as we possibly can. And if it leads us to places that we find uncomfortable, I hope we'll have the guts to look at it anyway. So any questions about deductive research as a concept? All right. So let's talk about induction. Induction is, again, the opposite. The best known example is the historical method. So you begin with that research question. The research question can be anything. It can be about anything. You start off, because the nice thing about induction is you don't have to pretend that you know anything to begin with. You just have a question that you want answered. And so you ask that question. Then you go out and you start finding data and you start researching. This is much less focused than inductive reasoning deductive reasoning. See, I'm doing it right now. I'm mixing it up again. Go by what's on the screen, not by what comes out of my mouth. So it's much less focused than deductive because you don't already know, I need to go here. So you have to go out and you have to figure out, what are the sources? Where are the best places to look? So there are extra steps there. And what that usually means too is that instead of just zeroing in on your 8 sources, you're probably going to have to deal with a lot more. So, let's say that we're talking about, I'm going to try to think of something else. We'll go with gaming again. Let's say you're going to do something about the game Mass Effect. If you've never played the Mass Effect series, do it. It's worth it. Up until the last 10 minutes of the third game. The last 10 minutes of the third game ruin the whole thing. Anyway, I've never been madder when I finished a game. You're going to go do something about Mass Effect. But if from the looks I'm seeing from several of you, you have no idea what I'm talking about. Well, what is Mass Effect? Where do you find the information? What platforms is it on? When was it published? All of those things are questions that you're going to have to answer in the very beginning before you can start to research the effects of that particular game. And by the way, yes, I actually sat on a master's thesis once that talked about Mass Effect. So yes, you can do this even at the master's level. That means you're going to have to cast your net much wider. Instead of just going straight to those 8 sources, you may end up with 20 or 30 sources by the time you're done. Now, if you're sitting here going, 20 or 30? No way I'm doing that. Bear in mind that when I say you've dealt with 20 or 30, I don't mean that you've read them all cover to cover. Dealing with a source may be, okay, here's an article about Mass Effect. I don't need that. You're done. It may be something as simple as reading an encyclopedia, a wiki article on it. And then from that wiki article, you're able to go and you are able to identify, okay, I need to look at these 2 or 3 other sources. But the idea is you're going to have to cast your net wider. It's more of a fishing expedition than with deductive research. Well, after you've done enough, that's another problem you have with this kind of research, is knowing when is enough. Because the simple fact is there's so much information out there on the internet that you just have to draw the line sometime and say, I've read enough. Because you'll never finish otherwise on just about any of these topics. In my field, the American Civil War, even before the internet rolled around, I heard this statistic as applied to the late 90s. The war ended in 1865. Between the time the war ended in 1865 and the late 1990s, over, 100,000 books had been written on the American Civil War. And if you tried to read a book a day, you would die before you finished reading them all. And that, of course, was only up until the late 1990s. So if you're going to go do research on the American Civil War, you can't say, I'm going to research everything, because it is quite literally impossible. So what you have to do here, too, is you have to figure out what sources are good, what sources are enough, and you have to draw that line. Well, once you draw that line, then you move on to the analysis aspect. You ask, so what's the answer to my question? Whatever question you've asked, by the time you've educated yourself through your data and research, hopefully you should be to the point where you can say, this is the answer to the question. And then based on the answer to the question, then you unfold those 3 or 4 points that you need in order to inform your reader, and then you present your thesis and your theory as a result. So again, with the first, we started with the hypothesis and the theory, and we worked down. Here you start with a question, and you work up until you reach a theory. Does that all make sense? All right, so what do you think some of the advantages might be of inductive research? Why would you use this instead of deductive?
No bias.
That's, well, we're human, so there's always going to be bias, but yes, it is much less biased. You're not beginning the question, beginning with a decision and a thesis. So you're able to follow it much more in many more places. Why would that be an advantage too? Not just because no bias. Is there any reason that being able to follow the research different places might help you?
Give you an idea of how to form your paper?
No, that's part of it, is that you have more freedom in forming your paper or forming your thesis. It also means that as you move forward, you will be able to hopefully find new things to do. So, try to always, as I know it's a pain, but try to keep what we would call the long game in view through your entire career. So right now, you're writing a paper in this class. Great. Guess what? You're going to have to write a 3BA thesis next year, right? There's no reason why the stuff you're working on here cannot play into your 3BA thesis. Now, yeah, you got to deal with your thesis advisor. And thesis advisors are their own animals. So I am not going to make any promises about your thesis advisor. But it's entirely possible that something you research here could become your topic for your thesis. Or research that you do here could be used in your thesis. So if you stop and think about that, what you're doing here may actually make life easier for you this time next year. And then what you do next year could become the basis of a PhD thesis. All of that's possible. And if you're not pigeonholed, zeroed in on one particular thing, you have freedom to follow that wherever you want it, wherever it goes. It's not just, have I finished my hypothesis? Yes, I'm done. It's, wow, look at this. Let's go over here. Let's see where this goes. Let's take this. Let's go that. You're also not pigeonholed in your thesis statement itself. You have more flexibility. So all of those are very good. And also, that's the other thing too, is that you can begin knowing nothing. So if you want to do this particular approach to research, you can literally go out and choose a topic that you know nothing about, but you think you might want to. And go find out, go research it. And then once you've got it, then you can move on from there. How about some disadvantages? We've already mentioned several.
Don't know what questions to ask, so you don't know what to research, and you have to read pretty much everything, hoping that there will be something there.
Yes, it's very often unfocused. And so it's difficult to complete, and it's easy to waste time discovering. Oh, that's another point I meant to mention was, it's very easy to waste time discovering that your thesis has been thought of before. What I mean by that is, as you start moving from this level on to the next, especially if you want to go into academics, people don't care. Right now, if you want to do the same paper that everyone else does, I guess so, go ahead. Professors get used to seeing people write the same paper over and over and over and over again. When I taught American history, I can't tell you how many papers I read about the biography of George Washington. Everybody wrote the blasted Washington paper over and over again. And finally you'd get a paper that was different. You're like, yes, I can read this without my eyes bleeding. At this level, that's okay, because it's like we said, it's practice or whatever. But if you want to try to actually get an academic job, you have to be published. And if you're going to be published, you're going to have to write about things that no one else has written about. And you're going to have to find topics to discuss that no one else has discussed. So when you look at this, if you're not careful, if you start researching, you're like, I want to look at this topic, and you research this topic, and you come up with this great thesis, and you're like, wow, this is really good stuff. I love this. And then when you find out that someone wrote that 10 years ago, and I don't want to say that all your effort has been wasted, because it hasn't, but this great big thesis that you hoped would be, your entry into the world of academics turns out to be nothing, because you weren't educated to begin with. This is the computer programming. The computer programming equivalent is coming up with this great idea for an app, sitting down and coding the whole thing, putting it on the App Store, and finding out 5 other apps are already out there doing the same thing. You don't want to do that. So that's why one of the reasons why you usually end up kind of as a mix of the two. But yeah, other than that, it's very unfocused. So again, you may have to study 20 sources in order to get 5. But it's usually better. Also, I say that immature or dishonest thinkers can use it to mask bias. People who are either not, this is going to sound awful, not smart enough to realize their own biases, or maybe worse, they realize their own biases and they just don't care. Sometimes they can pretend like they're following the inductive method. What they're really trying to do is foist their particular opinion on you. So the bias is there, it's just hidden. And so we ourselves, first, as scholars in this room, if you're going to take this approach, and if you haven't figured out, this is the approach I like, this is the one I encourage you to use, because I think it's most appropriate for what you're doing here. We as scholars in this room, we first want to look at ourselves and say, what are our biases, and make sure that we're not putting something illicitly in our work that we're not being honest about. And then on the other side is you want to keep an eye out, and as you're reading other sources, and this can be everything from an internet article all the way up to full-length dissertations, you want to make sure that the people you're reading aren't fooling you. They're not pretending to be unbiased while at the same time foisting their biases upon you. Anyway, at least I hope you care about that. So any questions about induction? All right. So let's talk about, just real quick, the steps to a deductive research paper. And yes, Benedict Cumberbatch. That was a great series for about the first 3 series. And then it just kind of went downhill. I haven't watched the last one. It was just so awful. Anyway. So, first, obviously, you choose a topic. And what I'm giving you here, literally, write this down, because this will take you from the very beginning of the research paper all the way to the very end. If you just do this, you will be in good shape. At least I hope you will. So first, you choose a topic, and we'll talk more about topics again in a second. Then you write a working thesis statement or a hypothesis. What you have to ask, what idea am I going to test? What idea out there is what I want to find out about? Then you do your research. That's pretty straightforward. You have to the big thing here, and this is key, is you have to ask yourself whether the sources you're looking at are sufficient to fairly test your hypothesis. You know, if you stop and think about it and you find out that you are really only looking at sources that agree with you, then you need to go out of your way to find sources that disagree with you. And that's going to be true of the other one too, but and my advice is you need to go out and you need to, I would say when you start your research, ask who is the person or what is the source that disagrees with this most profoundly. So, you know, you don't want to find a jerk, well, maybe, but you want to find, if you have your idea, you want to find somebody out there who is the strongest opponent of your idea, and you want to go read them. Because the strongest opponent of your idea is hopefully going to bring up the strongest arguments against it. So you'll know what you're dealing with. And in fact, if you are, as far as a full form research paper, if I read a research paper and you don't talk about some of these opponents, if you're not dealing with some of the critics, and of course in this case you're not arguing with the critics, you're just stating what the critics have to say, then you're going to be running into a problem. I'm going to be careful there because arguing with critics is 3BA stuff. At this point, we're still just presenting the point of view. Then you test your hypothesis. If you're going to test your hypothesis, there are really only three options as a result. You can accept it as it is, you can modify it as needed, and you can reject it entirely. 1, 2, 3. As a result of what you do, what you find, you form your paper thesis, and you ask, what is your result? Now, there are two ways, by the way, you can do this. You don't have to say, I had this hypothesis, and I tested it, and my result is this. That's the scientific method form that if you go into scientific experimentation, that's what you'll be doing. Here, you can simply state the new thesis. You can simply say, this is the truth, and you can argue it. You can exposit it. You decide which expository mode best fits your goals. This is an important point. So you can stop and ask, using The Witcher again, using The Witcher example, if we're looking at the American version that's come out from Netflix and the original Legends, what kind of paper do you think that would fit that well?
Contrast.
Yeah, compare, either one. Compare or contrast. All right, so you got your form. Then once you've got your form, you write that detailed outline. I really encourage you to write a long outline. Fill up a page, single-spaced, with your outline. You have the time to do it. This isn't like an exam situation where you're just jotting things down because you're in a hurry. And really, all I can say is I can promise you, having written many things, seeing it down on the paper will save you a ton of time and effort when it comes to actually writing it. This is the pitch that I make to people. You can spend, let's say, an hour writing a detailed outline and then maybe an hour writing your first draft. Or you can ignore the detailed outline and you can spend 5 hours writing your first draft. And then another 10 hours editing it because your organization is off and you don't know what you're dealing with. So you're constantly going back, rereading, fixing errors. Do the detailed outline and the errors don't show up to begin with. It really does save you time. Once you've got that first draft, you go back and you edit for content and grammar again and again and again and again. And then whenever you're finished, you submit your paper. My advice to you, and this is going to be true of deductive versus inductive, whatever, is that get your draft written at least a week before the due date. Now here, I have not written the syllabus for next semester, so I don't know when the due dates are going to be. But your first draft is going to be required much earlier than the actual due date. But in general, when you're just writing papers for classes, leave yourself some space. The first draft, by the way, can be full of errors. You want to keep the errors to a minimum, but everybody's first draft has plenty of errors. So what I try to do is if I have a project like that I'm working on, let's say it's 2 weeks in advance, it's a paper or a book review or something like that. 2 weeks in advance, just get the thing written. Just throw it all out there and then walk away from it and leave it alone. And then that way, you know you're in good shape. You know you've got your paper written. All you have to do is go back and fix it. Perfect papers are never made in the draft writing phase. They're created in the editing phase. So, any questions about deduction? How about induction with Detective Pikachu? Who's peeking at you? Anyway. So, the main difference here is going to be in the early parts. So here, of course, you choose a topic, then you ask a question. You do not answer the question. Try to resist the temptation to preemptively answer the question. And I know that's tough because when there's a question, people want to answer it. And if you doubt that, just stay on the internet until you find yourself tempted to click on one of those clickbait articles that say, how did such and such happen? Or what is this one weird trick? People want to know the answers to questions. And so that's why they do that. People will click on them. But here, resist the temptation. Don't answer the question prematurely. Go out and research your topic. Then, once you've got your research done, go back and review your research, looking for trends, looking for patterns, looking for that answer to your question. Once you've got all of that behind you, once you are educated and intelligent, then write the answer to your question, i.e. write your thesis statement. This is just exactly like we said before. Ask your research question, answer your research question in one sentence, and you've got your thesis statement. Then decide which expository model works best for your thesis or goal. Like we said before, you've got your thesis. You might, to use The Witcher, maybe you're going to look at something about how have the Witcher legends transformed as they've gone from Polish legend into Netflix series. That's probably not going to be a comparison-contrast paper. What might you use for that one? Process, yes, process analysis. You might also find cause and effect. There are different ways you can do it, but identify the one you want and you've got your outline already pretty much prepared. Then write that detailed outline, write the first draft, edit for content and grammar, and submit your paper. Something that might help you with this, and again, this is the version I suggest that you do. You can try this. Eventually you won't need it, but it worked for me when I was younger. And it's really easy now. Everybody I know has a Gmail account, I'm sure. Go to your Gmail calendar and put this process with deadlines for yourself into your calendar and so it sends notifications to you. So by the end of this term, you need to have a topic chosen. So set yourself a date sometime in the next 2 or 3 weeks where you're going to have a topic chosen. And set it to send you a reminder like a week or a day or whatever before you've set your deadline so that you know to be working on it. It's really nice. All the crazy stuff you have going on in your life, you just get pings on your smartphone telling you you need to be doing this, you need to be thinking about this, you need to be remembering this. I'll tell you, if I did not have my Google Calendar, I would probably have just fallen off the face of the planet by this point. And so do that for the whole process. So that you know what you should be doing at each point. All right, so we're going to do just a quick refresher about topic choices because the same things we talked about earlier apply just as well here. Possibly this is your most fundamentally important step. As we said before, it's like building a pyramid or a building. Your foundation is the most important thing. If you screw up the foundation, everything else from there on up is going to be screwed up. I told you all the horror stories like the time that I almost failed a class because I did not stop to think about my topic. And I ended up with with a paper I couldn't write because I chose my topic poorly. So take it seriously. Think about it right now. Try to have a topic chosen by the time we come back next week, in fact. So here's what you're aiming for. Number one, make sure it interests you. You're going to be spending the next 3 to 4 months of your life dealing with this topic. So don't choose something just because somebody else says it's important. Choose something that you want to learn about. And if it's something you want to learn about, then all of that research and reading that you're doing is not going to be a chore. It's not going to be a burden. It's going to be something that maybe you even look forward to. And that can make a huge difference in the quality of your paper and your research. Make sure you have a starting point. Educate yourself enough about the topic so that you know where and how you can begin. Make sure it's possible. And I would advise you to do something with easily available sources. There may be a topic out there that you're really, really, really passionate about and interested in, but what good does it do if all of the sources are in France? Yeah, and you think that's strange. It happens. I know there's a period of Polish history that you can't research the primary sources in unless you go to Sweden, because on one of the many invasions, I mean, unfortunately, y'all have been invaded all the time here in Poland. On one of the many invasions, the Swedes took a whole bunch of Polish documents and resources and whatnot back with them to Sweden, and they're still there. They haven't given them back. So there's a period of Polish history that if you want to research that part of Polish history, you have to go to archives in Sweden. And so, of course, it's probably not going to be that crazy, but if you choose something that you would say have to do primary research over in the States for, you're just not going to be able to do that. So for your own sake, choose something that's popular, choose something that's easily available. Keep using The Witcher as the example. The Witcher is huge right now. So you can find tons of sources out there about The Witcher. So it's an easy thing to do. You can have your research over in less than an hour for this whole paper. At least you're assembling your sources. Choose something that you can deal fairly with. We've talked about, I've beaten that dead horse about as much as I'm going to beat it. If you choose something that you don't feel so passionate about that you feel like you'd have to lie in order to assure that you're right. Yeah. When I visited here in 2017, they were actually dynamiting things out in the courtyard. So this actually isn't that bad. Anyway, and then be willing for this to be something that you can even find out you're wrong about. I mean, just to be honest, if you look at something, I think this is a good topic, but I feel really passionate. You get that sort of uncomfortable feeling in your stomach when you start thinking, maybe, what if I look at the other side of this? And what if the other side turns out to be right? Probably not the topic for you. Great topic for somebody else who can be more fair, but for you yourself, focus on something that you can be fair about. Some specific topic tactics that we have here. Brainstorming. Well, we'll get back to that in a second. Free writing, it's too weird for me, but free writing is literally where you just sit down and you say, okay, I'm just going to start writing whatever comes into my head. Brainstorming is thinking of ideas. I've got this idea, I've got that idea, I've got the other idea. Free writing is, I'm just going to start typing stuff and see what comes out. And so it's like, I'm going to write an essay about nonsense. And so you just start writing. Now, why would you do that? Well, as one idea flows into the other, sometimes you come across things that are kind of interesting. And you think, I hadn't thought of that before. Maybe that's a good topic. Think about your life. What things interest you? What are you already proficient in? What would I would love for you all to break new ground with your research in this class. But if you're really, really crazy busy and you're barely able to keep things together, because who knows, maybe you're traveling to Poznan every day from 2 hours away, and then you get here and you've got a full class load, and then you go home and you work, and you've got your sister to take care of, and your mother's broken her leg, and well, whatever. All of these awful things are going on, and you're just barely keeping your head above water. Well, choose something that's really easy. Choose something that you can write about right now. Choose something that you know. Choose something that you're interested in. Take a hike, go for a run, tackle a different project. Some of the best ideas I have ever come up with for my own writing come when I'm doing something not connected to writing. So when we lived in Virginia, I'd go for a hike in the mountains. And I would, as I'm hiking on the Appalachian Trail, I'd be thinking about these things, and I would come up with ideas because I wasn't sitting there, I'm going to think of something. I don't know if any of y'all have seen Winnie the Pooh walking around going, think, 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 think. That doesn't always work. So distract yourself. More scholarly, hit the books. If you want to do something scholarly, find some scholarly books that you're interested in. If we were doing Germany, find some books about Germany. Scan through them. Look for ideas where this hasn't been examined so closely, and go for that. Look up, and if you don't want to do any of that, if you want the really simplest way, go and Google a list of general topics for research papers. And yes, there are whole lists out there that have just hundreds of topics for research papers. Scroll down through them and find one that doesn't scare you. That works. Now, of course, I would suggest you do the others, but again, if this is what you got to do, it's what you got to do. That's all possible.